This is research suggests that thinking long-term may help resolve conflict more cooperatively and effectively. So this was a study that basically the author was studying how does consideration of future consequences influence our conflict management styles, and what role do our decision-making tendencies play in this relationship? So, I mean, in those, and to some extent, a lot of this is kind of what it has existed for a while in terms of, kind of looking at conflict resolution and intergroup conflict and how we kind of address those. But she was really focusing on this idea of the consequences in the future and how we view that and how does that shape everything. So she did 2 studies. Study 1 included 148 participants. All were Indian and they were recruited online. And they were given a questionnaire where they provided their demographic information, and they answered questions and rated on some scales about their conflict management style, how they tend to approach conflict, how they tend to try to resolve it. As well as what their considerations for future consequences are. And then study 2, they had 74 participants, though they ended up excluding 13 for various reasons. Again, all recruited online. They did another questionnaire. This one regarded questions for, again, the future consequences and conflict management styles. They also included the Melbourne DMQ questionnaire, and the Harmon one-factor test was employed to prevent common method bias. So this one was just kind of delving in a little bit more, again, kind of gauging those same questions from the first round, but then also how their decision-making tendencies come into play and how they approach things that way. And then looking at that total, how that relationship impacts conflict management styles and their future consequence regards. So if we can go to the second one. So study 1 found that consideration of future consequences does impact our conflict management styles, indicating that if someone has a higher regard for future consequences, they are more likely to prefer cooperative conflict management. And if they are on the lower end of that, they are more likely to prefer competitive conflict management, kind of leaning more towards getting things addressed immediately, not necessarily rationally, but just taking that first out kind of to get that conflict resolved, and not considering as much what that means down the road. It can be a little bit more selfishly focused, whereas the cooperative aspect is looking more at how they can work together, of course, with that person, and what does that mean, farther down the road in terms of their relationships. And study 2 found that vigilant decision-making and hypervigilant decision-making were correlated with CFC, vigilant being positively so and hypervigilant being negatively so. It's not entirely exclusive, and they do suggest that there should be further research done in this regard because it has not been heavily studied. But the implications that we're overall getting is that our decision-making styles mediate the relationship between CFC and our conflict management styles. So if we typically, she was showing the vigilant decision-making tends to be a little bit more correlated with cooperative conflict management, and hypervigilant a little bit more with competitive conflict management. And that the way we use those, kind of explains a little bit of that relationship between our future consequence regards and how we address conflict. So the research suggests overall that our consideration for future consequences can predict our conflict management preferences, and also that our decision-making tendencies have an influence on that relationship. So how we anticipate future consequences tied into how we generally address decision plays a factor in all of that. The more likely we are to have greater consideration for future consequences, the more likely we are to lean toward cooperative conflict management styles, and likely already hold vigilant decision-making preferences. So one of the notes that she had was actually geared towards organizations and what that means in terms of a leadership, and how they address conflict. And really she's suggesting that people do more trainings on how to teach people to be more aware of future consequences. So while a lot of this, and she does discuss how, personality has a lot to play in this, typically people, how you address conflict or how you make decisions, a lot of that is kind of a personal thing that just comes out of who you are as a person, your background, etc. But because of this idea that the future consequences can kind of lean you more towards that cooperative aspect because you're thinking long term and down the road. There's a suggestion there to create trainings, especially for people in leadership decisions or who are making decisions, so that they can kind of take that approach more. So I think that that was a really interesting concept, and it makes a lot of sense too, right? Like if you're really thinking about not only now but also later, you are more likely to kind of try to preserve those relationships and make things work in a positive way.
Yeah, I like this a lot, and I feel like this is so relevant to a lot of the conflicts that we see in the workplace, right? With where things there isn't really that consideration for future consequences, and that's why things fester for so long, which is why the conflict just, again, like festering and just getting worse and worse until they reach out for services, right? And if it's like, if there was that more of that higher consideration for the future, there would probably be less need for not just like conflict resolution, but I mean, it would happen sort of more organically, I guess, if there was more of that consideration for the future.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. I feel like there is a kind of like what Natalie, you were saying, like about the training idea. It's interesting. I feel like if people were able to, I feel like when people get into conflict, they can just so easily kind of get into their own realities, and people are very hyper focused on being right and making sure that they have control over things sometimes. And so I feel like this is almost like a reality test. Like it's saying like, let's focus on, how maybe what we're doing right now, it can be really destructive. I feel like it's a reality test. Like you're recognizing, like this, if this continues, like it might not end super well for me. So, of course I need to be cooperative and try to end this ahead of time.
Actually, I think that's a good point too, Noah, in the sense that if, and a lot of that focus too is on the feelings and things in the present too, and not thinking about your feelings down the road either in those conflicts, so it might feel good to be right in that moment, but is that better, down the road? I think that's a good point.
Right.
It's a really interesting tie to the conflict management styles, right? Because I think that I feel like we talk a lot about those and try to get people to think about, what is your typical conflict style, right? How do you address it? Depending on, obviously it's very situational, right? And who you're talking to, and there's the whole context needs to be considered, but just taking this concept of the future consequences and pairing that with the managed conflict management styles, I think this is really interesting. And I'm wondering, like, with your takeaway, Natalie, of training, like how we could really start thinking of, like, and talking about that more in our trainings. I don't know that we do that. I don't know that we really talk about the future consequences. We do, like, I feel like we touch on them, but this is making me think like maybe we should spend a little bit more time considering the future consequences and how that is related to the way that we manage conflict currently in the present.
It makes me think of the kind of the concept of mediation, where you're and you find this where parties get towards the end of the mediation. Maybe they've negotiated a good amount, and you're just like a little bit, just a little bit of space between both parties, and they're like, I'm gonna, maybe I just need to drop all this. I just want to have my day in court. I want to go and do this. And so, and the job of the mediator is to kind of examine that, like, well, okay, you can do that, but is that the smartest decision for you? Like the people's expectations of what their day in court looks like is often a lot different than what it actually looks like. And court decisions, because you're not directly deciding them, can be somewhat of a gamble, because you don't know what you're going to get. There's a lot of factors, a lot of different things involved that you don't have any control over. So it's the mediator's job to go and kind of show them the full picture to that degree, and so you can go to court, but you have the opportunity to decide for yourself now how to make your life better by ending this conflict. And I feel like that applies as kind of an analogy to the workplace as well. Kind of what you're saying, Sarah, is that it within a training might be that kind of reality test, that kind of focus towards the future that mediators give parties during mediation, because in the workplace you typically don't have that sort of formal person giving you advice on maybe the best path forward. So that it could be a great outlet for that.
What would that look like? What would training on having a greater consideration for future consequences look like?
I almost feel like it's like I don't even know if training, I don't know what training would look like. It seems more to me like a coaching sort of a thing, which I'm sure is what you do partially in coaching, is confronting maybe some certain perceptions or assumptions. But training is interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it's just asking the question of, what might a situation, hypothetical situation, look like? What might this lead to? Just asking that question to get people to think about what the future consequences might be if you took this route or if you took that route. And looking at different conflict management styles, what the possible response would be to an escalated person or whatnot, and then what would the future consequences be if you handled the situation this way, if you responded this way or that way,
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I feel like that would, that's good. It is like you're playing out scenarios in your head, what would happen, and I think that would be very effective. I don't know whether it works better in a coaching scenario or a training, because I feel like a training surrounding this, it's highly individual and can be kind of personal as to what people decide to do in any given circumstance. So maybe it's just a reminder of consider your future.
Yeah, just the building awareness part of the different possibilities